Uh, it's time on Friday afternoon to start my next presentation. I'm going to take off from a little to do that happened at the end of the last meeting. Aaron and I were teasing each other about the institution of marriage. That's a favorite game we play with each other. So I think I just want to talk for a few seconds before I pick up again about my thoughts about marriage as an institution. Uh, Marriage is really quite a challenge. I'm very respectful of people who decide they don't want to embrace its risks and its turbulence because it is a lot of work. I happen to cherish marriage. I believe in my own case, being able to rub up against some other continuing person and to open myself to the view of that person and to interact with them and hear back from them about how is being experienced and support and sustain them and do the same for them. It's very labor intensive, but I think it's been a wonderful educational experience for me. I don't know if I could have gotten that education in any other way except showing up every day trying to make life happen with one single other person. It is an enormous challenge. It doesn't surprise me that the divorce rates in this country are over 50%. Uh, we make unreasonable expectations of marriage. We teach people myths about what marriage is all about. Uh, there are people who don't want to do the labor. There are people who are wounded, so they can't allow themselves to get so close. Nobody needs to get married. Divorce rates would probably go down, as I think they will, because fewer and fewer people are marrying. And that's what's happening in the Western countries. The marriage rates are going down slowly. The rates of having children are going down slowly. And I don't look at that aghast. I think maybe there's some wisdom in that, and we ought to celebrate that rather than feel appalled about it. We're reaching a stage of evolution where nobody has to get married anymore and nobody has to have children anymore. Those don't need to be the ordinary destinations of adult life. But I'm still going to be a fan of marriage. It's like I'm a fan of higher education. That's hard and taxing too. But I think life is better if you enroll and learn what there is to be learned. And there both ways, having children and having a single other who you're making a partnership with, both of those are learning experiences like no other learning experiences. There's no other way to get the wisdom that comes with those kinds of things. And for myself, at least, I value both kinds of wisdom. Okay, that being said, I'm going to return to a paper I was reading last time. I got about a little over half through. It was a paper on the alienated child, the forces that create alienation post divorce, where one of the children or some of them don't want to visit with one of the parents anymore, and what can be done if you wind up in that position, and any of us can. I'll pick up the text where I left off. In Khalid Gibran's book, The Prophet, the poet reminds all of us that our children come through us, but are not part of us. Towards the end of his segment on parenting, he likens those of us who are parents to archers. We must shape our youth as we would craft arrows. Then at last we must fit them to our bows and send them away into the universe on their own trajectories. Being a parent is an exercise in extreme selflessness. Its purposes are the sustaining of those we have invited to enter into our care. It is not a vehicle for our fulfillment. Being a parent also means embracing an increasingly growing and at last a permanent separation from closeness with the children. We must not burden our children with our needs, our longings, our hopes, or our justification. The force of caring is to be sent descending down into the next generation. We do for our children. In turn, one day they will do for theirs. Yes, sometimes some scraps of goodness runs back uphill into our beings, but we must not expect it or demand it. Our holiest longings must be for our children to go forth in decency and wisdom and be liberated by us, their parents, to make their own lives something shining. They are not to be burdened with providing meaning or emotional sustenance for our troubled lives. That is to come from our finding our own ways to make use of our particular personal endowment and from the caring of others who are our peers and or our mate, not our children. We who have children must face an inevitable hurt. Separation from children comes to all parents. For those who are divorced, the process is accelerated. It comes much earlier, as soon as children begin to live in two houses rather than in one. And all of it gains momentum as the young people begin to go on play dates, hang out in the community with friends, go elsewhere to have peer companionship while they study, begin overnights in others' homes, travel, begin to date, and to fall in love and get ready to leave home fully. For divorced persons, mourning the loss of closeness begins at the moment of marital separation. If one of the parents has a child in residence for less than 50% of the child's life, then that parent begins quite early to take on some of the experienced properties in a child's mind of having become like an aunt or uncle rather than a parent. In many ways, being a parent is very much like having a garden to tend. The enterprise is a great deal of work. Sometimes it is backbreaking. We must cultivate the soil, fight predators, prune, fertilize, irrigate, and make sure that plants have the right balance of shade and sunshine and the proper soil chemistry. If we do the work thoughtfully and fully, we may be fortunate. Blossoms will emerge. The plants will flourish sturdily. But our joy can only be the joy of seeing how our plants have unfolded and what they have become. We can take pleasure from observing how much they have come to add beauty to the world. But our plants are not going to thank us. They're not going to be eternally grateful to us. They're not going to call us when we miss them. They are not going to show up when we want to hold them to some family ritual. They are not going to be interested in our struggles and give comfort to us about them. They are just there in the world, thriving, giving shade, giving color, putting oxygen back up into the depleted atmosphere of a tired planet, and forming seeds for their own progeny. The challenges and life currents I am surveying in this paper that course through divorced parents and their children often makes it difficult for a good adaptation to life to evolve in a way that sustains all the members of the divorced family who must endure the transition. Unfortunately, one or more of the 10 conditions I noted above often emerges, ones that can result from failures to understand and to manage well the stresses of the terrible life dislocations that flow from a decision to divorce. If a majority of the 10 comes into play, then some portion of the young people subjected to such awful turbulence will be at risk for separating from and repudiating one of their parents. I shall now describe what are the pitfalls of some of unthinking attempts made by banished parents to manage their banishment, and also the narrow possible range of reconciling possibilities available to alienated parents for beginning a process of reunification. It would be helpful for parents to pay careful attention to what follows. The suggestions are critical for initiating renewed movement toward an engagement with any child who has abandoned a parent. What are the moves that the alienated parent should avoid at all costs? Bullet. Under no circumstances make any utterances ultimately designed to engender guilt in the departed child. For example, I'm the one paying huge child support for you. You're just using me, taking advantage of me, and not doing your part. Or, quote, I miss you so much. How can you hurt me that way? Close quotes. It is a fact of human affairs that when we are made to feel guilty, we have additional reasons to hate the one doing it, and this encourages even further withdrawal. Bullet. Under no circumstances make any utterance that represents name calling or character assassination of the rejecting child. For example, you're an ungrateful brat, close quotes. Quote, you're a vain, self-obsessed little asshole, close quotes. Quote, I'm ashamed to be the parent of such a stupid and cruel child, close quotes. Attacks by a person in our life are never an encouragement to go forward and seek more of that person's company. Bullet, under no circumstances blame the other parent and suggest openly or even imply that the decision to reject is not really the child's decision, but that the child is merely the puppet of the other parent. For example, quote, you may not realize it, but your mother has brainwashed you. I'm a good father. She puts ideas in your head and you've been stupid to believe them, close quotes. None of us likes to hear that we are simply in someone else's thrall and that what appears to us as if they are our decisions are not really our decisions. We feel wiped out, discounted, and unheard. Once again, this will not instill a desire to move forwards towards the speaker. Bullet, under no circumstances retaliate, e.g., quote, well, if that's the way you want it, then I disappear, I will. Just consider me gone. If you ever change your mind and want something to do with me, I hope you'll be able to find me. I don't need to keep trying to see someone who keeps rejecting me. I'm not a fool, close quotes. Yes, that parent is indeed a fool. The foolishness of this response for me is self evident. It is a sulk. It is closing the door on the possibility of repair. In this instance, hurt pride is killing the chances for redemption. Bullet, under no circumstances attack the other parent, e.g., quote, your father must be gloating that you don't want to see me. He was always a bastard. I don't know why he gets to have your company when that scumbag went off with his whore and broke up our family. He gets a reward and I get shit on by you, close quotes. This kind of behavior only exacerbates the child's loyalty conflicts and increases the desire to draw away from the person who is uttering such hateful and poisonous rhetoric. Bullet, under no circumstances threatened or actually use the club that may have been given to you, the rejected parent, by the court. If an order is in place directing specified times for a child to be with a parent, that parent in many venues can contact the local police. Accompanied by the police and a copy of the order, the parent can show up at the child's school or at the child's residence and attempt to coerce the child, even with threats of going to juvenile hall, into coming for a visit. I do not know of a single case where such behavior resulted in any improvement in an already inflamed and tragic circumstance. So, what are the moves that the alienated parent should attempt that might soften the impasses? Bullet, be certain to begin with an apology. I cannot stress the importance of this too strongly. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. All of us have failed our offspring on occasions. Faced with such a devastating loss, it is time to become reflective and ask ourselves what is our part of what has happened that we have contributed. We may not have played the largest part in the alienation drama, but we certainly bear some culpability. Try to identify the 3 or 4 most hateful or hurtful moments that have been exchanged with the child you have lost. If your child would be willing to visit with you, to listen to you take responsibility for your failings, it would be wonderful to see the child in person. If the child is unwilling to see you in person and alone, find out if the child could listen to you in the presence of a family counselor or so that there could be a safe space. If the child simply will not agree to be physically present with you anywhere, then write or email your self-assessment and your apology to your offspring. Consider the following example. Quote, Sarah, you're not willing to see me anymore. I'm truly sorry that you've come to that conclusion. It must have been a painful and difficult choice for you. We haven't spoken much about how your decision came about. I've been too busy, I think, being angry at your dad for poisoning your mind or yelling at you for how you were treating me. I don't know if I could have listened to you, even if you had tried to tell me more. I wish I could take so many of my words back. They're hateful, and it must have been so miserable for you to listen to the ranting in such a to me ranting in such a fashion. I've also trying to think back and to remember how else I may have failed you. I'm going to have to guess since you haven't told me these things yourself, but I'm remembering the years I was so frightened about your sister's diabetes. She took up almost all my time. I know I pushed you away over and over again. I know I wanted you not to need much from me, to be self sufficient, and even, and I curse myself for this, to be my assistant in caring for your sister. You must have felt so cast out of my life. And after a few years spent helping your sister to stabilize her illness, no sooner did that come to some peace that I decided to go back to school and get a degree. I was gone for so many hours. When I was home, I would shut myself up in the den to study and write my papers. You and your sister were left to fend for yourselves. In a way, I'm not surprised that your father finally decided to divorce me. I would love to know if the things I'm telling you that I now deeply regret were as painful to you as my memories of these are for me as I think back. I would like to talk more with you about all of it. I would like to spend my life trying to make whatever amends I could for all the distress I caused you. Please let me know if we could at least begin to talk. Close quotes. If you cannot initially embark on a renewed flow of communication with your offspring, learn to practice patience. Every few weeks, invent some kind of goodness to bestow on your lost child and ask for nothing in return. For example, send tickets to an amusement park, a movie, or a concert that your offspring might enjoy, along with some simple message such as, quote, my love for you is still in place. Your being away from me will not stop my love. I was thinking of you and I thought you might enjoy these tickets. Take whomever you would like to have by your side. Close quotes. Bullet. Send random text messages, emails, or note cards with loving sentiments on them, but do not space these too closely together. You do not want your child to feel nagged at or intruded upon. The messages should be love and appreciation. Quote, I passed the junior high today when the kids were leaving. I thought of you. I did check your grades online the other day, and I felt so impressed with how well you seem to be recovering from our family's troubles and are applying yourself again. You should be feeling very proud of yourself. Close quotes. Do not ask for any response. Bullet. Be sure to honor important ritual events in the child's life. Do something the child would appreciate for his or her birthday. Do what has been a tradition for holiday times. For Mother's Day or for Father's Day as appropriate, send a greeting card with a message like, quote, I know I'm not going to be seeing you on Mother's Day. It is coming though, so I've been thinking of you. You were only in my life for a dozen years, but I want you to know how glad I am to be your mother and how much I cherish memory of those years I was able to be with you. My memories of knowing you and my taking delight in the fact that you were alive and are still alive. Close quotes. Once or twice a year, send a message that you will not abandon hope, that someday the two of you might be present together in whatever way that would, of course, remain to be defined together. Ask if the child is ready yet for such an event, but do not pull at the child. Make it clear that you will accept that the received answer of no answer from the child that is itself an answer, and you will then drop the subject for now. Bullet. Be prepared to use creative seduction. Invite the child on interesting vacations with you and the new person, if any, in your life. Quote, I've made arrangements to take a bareboat cruise around the American Virgin Islands for 2 weeks in August. I've invited Sally. We've been spending more time together. And since there's an emptiness in my life without you, I've invited your favorite cousin Jake to come along. He wants to get away from his family for a while this summer. Is there any chance you'd be willing to break your absence from my life and come with us? I think it would be the vacation of a lifetime. And if there's a friend of yours you'd like to have with you, I'm sure we could squeeze in even one more person. You can design an infinite variety of temptations if you're creative and put your mind to it. Bullet. You must be the carrier of whatever is the energy required to sustain your one sided relationship with a child. Bear the burden. Expect nothing in return. Offer love and connection over and over again, year after year. As your child comes ever closer to emancipation, the child is also beginning to throw off the influence of your former spouse and to think increasingly for himself or herself. Bullet. Under some circumstances, consider a return to court. Only under some circumstances, though. If you have accumulated a record of steady, kind, loving responsiveness to a child who has fled, even if your efforts have never been acknowledged or rewarded, ask that there be a renewed custody evaluation. This is tricky. Your child will resent being dragged through litigation hell. You will encounter orienting tendencies that are part of the overarching philosophy pursued by those who interact with the court. Judges and commissioners have a bent towards mandating equal custody and visitation, and another bias in favor of undertaking reunification of alienated children and parents. Custody evaluations have a tilt towards recommending shared custody and visitation unless their investigation unearths conduct that is egregious. So far, so good. But while you're likely to get a set of orders reopening the road forward towards reconnecting with your rejecting child, the court often does not do enough to get effective support to you. You may be confronted with a challenge of what to do if your child starts yelling or crying, or yelling and crying, or yelling and crying and running away about visiting you, whether or not this is ordered to do so once again by the court. Yes, you can get the police involved, but I cannot recommend this. What often is required to make such a solution work is in the hands of the judge supervising your case. What the judge might consider doing is to recommend that the other parent get some treatment around from a mental health professional around the issue of why one child is not willing to visit the other parent. The parent who has captured the child may be the key to the release of the child, but very few courts will order such a thing. While any person who has lost access to the child cannot compel a judge to so rule and to so act, the papers filed with the court could certainly request such an intervention. Unfortunately, the solution is rarely imposed by the court. It's imposed by the parents, by the child, and by the simple passage of patient time. Uh, I think I'll use my own life as an illustration before I go on to the same topic. I lost visitation with one of my two children, with the little girl who I adopted. She went into orbit around her needy mother, and starting in elementary school, there were more and more excuses for why she wasn't keeping a particular visit at one time or another. And often the excuses were made for her by her mother, who would report that she was going to be studying at so and so's house and couldn't do the sleepover she was scheduled to do with me because she was going to stay there for the night and sleep over, or another family was taking her out of town for the weekend. By the time she was 12, 70% of my requests for visitation had been turned down for some reason or another. And I had been keeping a careful log of that. And I talked to Hermine, my present wife, and we decided that we were going to make a renewed custody attempt. The California law also has a strange and potentially wonderful stipulation in it that the parent who seems most willing to share the child should get more of the child's time than the parent who is stingy about sharing time. I guess the court is willing to punish parents who act that way, as if they wanted to capture the child. So we thought we had a shot at getting significant change in visitation. We'd also been hearing from Naomi, my daughter, that my former wife's relationship with her live-in boyfriend was very tumultuous, that they had loud and angry fights. And over the years that she had been living there with them, they had separated for significant amounts of time, for 5 or 6 weeks at a crack before they reunited and the troubled relationship they had with each other resumed. And I wanted to contrast the two households. She had two step siblings, my no, step siblings living in my house. They loved her. They were always happy when they came. She was like a little baby they could play with, and then a little sister they could teach or play school with or some other wonderful game. They welcomed her visit. She was much loved. I was in a stable second marriage. There was no turbulence and craziness and fights and screaming going on in my house. There was no developmentally disabled child who could turn into a tyrant. He attempted to strangle her on 3 separate occasions, and my former wife had to pull him off of her physically to get him to stop trying to kill her. None of that was going on in my house, so I thought I had a reasonable shot at getting a big increase. I even wanted sole custody, just like she had had, and I would be gracious and much more magnanimous and give her the reasonable visitation rights. So we started a custody battle, and that turned out to be a very, very, uh, I was gored. Whatever I did feels wrong to me. Starting the battle feels wrong, and I eventually abandoned the battle, and that feels wrong to me too. My poor child started going through hell. She feverishly was trying to design different patterns of visitation herself and propose them to me and to her mother, trying to hope she could negotiate her own way out of this dilemma and not have to go through hours of custody evaluation, being evaluated, living with uncertainty, being on the edge of litigation constantly for months on end. And her suffering finally persuaded me to stop. I stopped knowing I might lose her entirely across the later span of her adolescence. And as a matter of fact, the fact that I had even pulled her back into the turbulence of the custody battle may have been further reason for her not to want to come and see me and to repudiate me. I thought I might prevail, and the best I was going to get was 50-50 because the courts were very fascinated then with beginning to experiment with giving 50-50 custody to young people. And I've never been a fan of that. I really think the children should have a primary home, even if there can be a lot of visitation time with the other parent, particularly during the school year. They should not be bouncing back and forth from one place to another frequently. Custody can be made 50-50. Custody can be made up with big chunks of recess time out of school and big chunks of summer vacation to the parent with whom they're not living during this, mainly during the academic year. But designing those things is another topic for another time. I did liquidate the custody battle. I threw in the sponge, told my former wife I was dropping the suit. Peace was coming. And my sour prediction came true. The amount of time she was not available started increasing, and I barely saw her at all by middle adolescence. She did come if we were taking a vacation to a wonderful place. She often would come with us on the vacation and be very welcomed and have a fine time. But I could tell that every time she told her mother that she was going to come and do something with us, I'm sure she got crap, even if only in nonverbal communication from her mother. But she had to pay a price of being chastised, scolded, and attempted to be made to feel guilty for even wanting to be with me. I found a good seduction when she was 17. I was in the early stages of experimenting with computers. I was an early adopter of computer technology. I was learning to do word processing, and I was learning to try and automate my billing for my practice. And it was arduous and time consuming. And on the balance, I think it was doing good things for me, but was not fun. And then I had a creative idea. She came over once for a visit. I forgot what the occasion was. And I said, Naomi, would you like a part-time job after school a couple days a week? And she said, well, what would I be doing? And I said, well, I have a computer in there, and computers are the wave of the future. You learn how to use the computer. And I need you to do some correspondence for me, to keep some records for me, and to do my billing of my clients. And I could probably keep you busy for about 3 hours twice a week after school. And I'll tell you what, you and I live about 4 miles from each other, so the transportation is a problem. But Hermine and I keep an extra car. We keep an extra old car in good condition in case one of our cars has to go in the shop. So we're cycling between three cars. I she always called the extra car Herbie. I'd be glad to give Herbie to you. You could keep Herbie at home. You could go to school, go to high school in it during the day. You could go out with your friends in it. It's yours. Use it for whatever you want. But then you'd have a way to get over here. I would know you'd be able to come over. Now, I have to warn you, once in a while, I might say you have to bring Herbie back for 2 days. The car's going in the shop, and drive you back home, and you'd be carless for a few days. But that's how people with cars have to live. They have to figure out some other form of transportation if a car has to be attended to. Would you like that? And yeah, she said, let me try that. I think I would. So she started coming twice a week. We gave her the used car. And afterwards, sometimes we would just invite her for dinner because she'd get finished at 6 o'clock at night. She'd work from 3 to 6, and she'd be finished. I say, well, you want to stay for dinner? And she said, oh, all right, let's have dinner. And she would stay for dinner. Then after a while, she said, would you mind if I stayed and did my homework? I don't feel like going home. Let me just stay here. I'll do my homework, and then I'll go back and go back and sleep at home. And then once in a while, she would say, is my bedroom still here? I said, of course. She said, well, I think I'll sleep overnight and just get up and go home in the morning. So she started to voluntarily just stay with us more and more and more without my having to pull at her. And then the biggest turn happened after she went away to UC Santa Barbara and was no longer living at her home. She started to come and visit on her own. We would go up and visit her in Santa Barbara. And she started to tell me horror stories then about what it had been like growing up in that house, having to defer to her damaged brother, having to listen to the fights between Ed and my former wife, being frightened to go near my brother when he was throwing temper tantrums. She there's a book called The Normal One, and I forget who the author is, but she was living the text of that book. The analyst in New York who wrote the book had a number of young people in her practice, young adults typically, who had grown up in households where there was a defective, damaged, or troublesome child, and they described the pains of having been ignored, not being parenting, losing their childhood, having to grow up too fast, having to help in the care of the other child who was the damaged one, and the various wounds inflicted on it. So I was hearing a real life recitation of that from my daughter. And the alienation evaporated over time because I didn't give up and kept trying to do the things that I outlined in my paper. And they do work. You have to be very patient and very selfless though to make them come true. And sometimes you'll fail altogether. You will not be able to break down the bitterness of the years gone by. All right, I will now take a breath and change subjects. My second subject is, I will go on for where I left a few weeks ago. The California School of Professional Psychology Los Angeles campus was about to open, and we had a celebration, and I had figured out how to get the students to continue and start school. And I had said the idiotic thing to my wife as we had gone home that night. Oh my God, the real problems are now over. We have classrooms, we have students, we have a faculty, and we have administration. And now productivity will start, work will take place, and we will do what we need to do to make the school blossom and prosper. There were obviously three goals: to make sure that the graduates could sit for the licensing exam and that the Board of Psychology would recognize the education we were giving as worthwhile and worthy of leading to licensure. We would get the State Department of Education to agree to give us degrees. Oh, there were four hurdles we had to get over. We had to get over the hurdle of getting the place regionally accredited by the Western Association of Schools and Colleges because no federal financial aid is available to non-accredited institutions. And if we wanted to be able to recruit students widely and support students from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, we had to be able to have a federal financial aid package. And finally, we needed approval by the American Psychological Association because entry to the most prestigious internships around the nation were contingent on being enrolled in or having graduated from an American Psychological Association approved academic institution. I know what my agenda of work was to be. I had to supervise developments on campus, figure out how to give the site visitors who would be coming what they wanted to see and make that happen. That was going to be my prime function. Turned out that wasn't to be my prime function at all. It turned out that those were some of the most tumultuous years of my life, some of the most interesting and challenging and also torturing moments of my life. I clearly was coming close to becoming an alcoholic by the end of the 7 years I had served in that position. And I want to tell the story of what it was like trying to it was like riding a bucking horse every minute of the day. It was terrible. As is most stories, the personalities of some of the players have had significant effect on what happened to the institution. Primary among these was the institution's founding president, Nicholas Cummings, whose office was in San Francisco. That's where now the home office of the school structure was. We opened with two campuses, but Nicholas Cummings had what we used to call an edifice complex. It wasn't enough that the California School of Psychology have two campuses, one in San Diego and one in San Francisco. He now wanted to add campuses in Fresno and in San Diego. And he started massaging the local psychologists and talking to people he knew from those communities about would you be willing to be the dean of those campuses, and talking to some of the wealthy members of our board of trustees to see if they would fund and help contribute the seed money to get those campuses open and operating too. So we had to deal with his arrogance in wanting to have four campuses instead of two. That made everything much more complex. And then he was, in some ways, a person who shared some of Donald Trump's characteristics. He told big stories, and you could never tell whether he was telling the truth or not. One of the big stories he told was that he had gotten his doctorate from, where did he go? Uh, the private university on Long Island. What the hell? Oh, it'll come back to me. He had finished his doctorate faster than any other student who had ever gone there. That was one of the things he told us. Uh, he told us that he was descended. He was a Greek prince. He was descended from Grecian royalty, and he was a prince. And he owned a Greek island that was his personal possession in the Adriatic. He told us. And I don't know if it was true or not. Oh, and he had a 100-foot sailboat anchored there, and he would go every summer and take a couple weeks off and sail on his sailboat in the Adriatic and be worshipped by the people who lived on the island. The prince was coming home for a few days. Uh, didn't have any Greek accent that I could tell. He also I started the sentence, I'll go back another way. I got to know him much better before the school ever opened, because one of the things we did was we were going around the country to local psychological meetings, state psychological meetings, and the national meeting. Some team of people connected with the school would go by and stop by, get time on the program to present the dream we were trying to make a reality, to encourage potential students to think of applying, to ask potential faculty members were they interested in considering being considered when we got more full-time faculty. Would they consider moving to Southern California? Would they be interested? And doing fundraising. We need contributions. We need seed money to get this going. And those of you in the audience who's listening, could you write us a check? Or we set up one of the world's first websites. Here's a website, and you can make a contribution via credit card. So we were doing all that. So Nick and I were partnered up frequently. I don't know why. He must have liked traveling with me. And we would share a hotel room to save money. We get a room with twin beds. And he made it very clear to me from the beginning that he could not sleep. This was going to be very hard. He apologized to me, but he could usually not sleep very well at night unless he had sex in the early evening. When he was home in his ordinary life, he made sure to have after dinner sex every day, because that ensured that he would get a good night's sleep. And if he didn't have after dinner sex, then there was going to be trouble. He apologized to me for being restless, and he said that was hard. He was in combat supposedly after the Normandy invasion, and it was pretty hard to get away from his assignments, to find some local that he could have sex with. He had many a sleepless night while I was in combat, but he had one glorious experience. He had the unit he was attached to had conquered a chateau. They had liberated it, and he was told to stay behind and guard the chateau while the others went on and tried to advance further that day. And they thought the chateau was abandoned. And if the Germans came, he should call them on the walkie-talkie and they would come back quickly to support him. Otherwise, he should just make sure that no locals were stealing crap out of the chateau. He had this long, elaborate story. So he went on an inspection tour of the inside of the chateau, and he saw there was a huge wine cellar in the basement. And then on a couch that had been pulled in down there in between the rows in the wine cellar, there was a beautiful woman reclining on the couch. She had gone there down there to get out of combat and was ensconced there to become silent. She wasn't certain whether it was safe for her to come back or not. And of course, he spoke fluent French, she said. I have no idea whether he spoke fluent French or not. So he assured her that everything was fine up above, and he had been sent to guard the castle. It was now safely in American hands. The advanced American party would come back if the Germans dared to show up again, and he would protect her from any marauding villagers who might be tempted to violate the property. And she gave him a big, excited kiss, and they started to make out. And he had, oh, and she opened him a very special bottle of wine from out of the collection. And he had the best afternoon of his life ever, just having endless sex with this woman and drinking the finest wines imaginable. And I said, well, look, what happens when you go to Washington? We've all become very active in the American Psychological Association. I know you're in Washington 6, 7, 8 weekends a year. What do you do? He said, I have that one knocked. He says, I I tell any committee that I'm on or board meeting I'm going to have that I have to get out at 4 o'clock. I have some things I have to do in the city when I come to visit. So we have to stop at 4 o'clock. I need an early exit. and I go to some large government building and I wait for people to start coming out from work from those government buildings. I find the most attractive woman that I can see quickly, and I walk up to her and I apologize. I say, "Excuse me for bothering you. I'm looking for," and I'll name some landmark that I'm going to visit. I tell them I'm a tourist. I'm going off to see such and such, and they tell me where it is and how to get there. And I say, "Well, I'm not very good at directions. If you have some free time, you seem like a pleasant person. I love your company. Would you like to go visit the statue again? Have you ever really taken a good look at it? I'm an expert on sculpture, so I can tell you something about every statue in this town." And he hot talks them into spending time with them, and then he thanks them for the time and say, I'm in your debt. You've been a very nice companion. Can I buy you dinner?" And then he buys them dinner, and then he takes them to the sack before he goes to bed. He never fails. He never strikes out. If he has trouble with the first, he goes on to the second, and he can tell who's likely to come with him. So that's his technique for taking care of his sexual needs when he's traveling. And sounded like a bunch of horseshit to me, but I never told him that. All I did was keep apologizing that he was stuck with me and he was going to have a restless night. Uh, there was another thing about him. Oh, there were two other things about him that really made me ongoing trouble after we opened. One thing was that he had a mistress. She was his assistant in his practice. She ran his office and his practice in San Francisco. And when he became president of the new institution, he promoted her, and she was now his system wide administrative assistant. And he had an interesting lifestyle. He would stay at his office because he was very busy. He had his practice to run, and he had all the affairs of the California School of Professional Psychology to pay attention to. He had persuaded his wife he needed to remain in his office 4 days a week, but he'd come home to be with her and the children 3 days a week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And he had a bedroom and a bath and all the things he needed for residence in the rear end of his office quarters. And he actually had moved his administrative assistant in. She was living full time in the bedroom. He was in the bedroom those nights, and they were lovers. And the gossip soon began to be whispered, and then it soon became apparent that it was true. She accompanied him to every meeting. When he would come to visit the Los Angeles campus, she would come with him. She was always by his side when he was on university business. And ordinarily, we wouldn't have cared, but he made it even more complicated for us because as the school grew and the campuses took hold, he said he needed more senior personnel with more responsibility in central office. So he was going to name her his vice president for student affairs. She was suddenly going to become a vice president of the corporation. And what were her responsibilities? They were taking admissions away from the campuses. All admissions would be done centrally in central office, and the admissions decisions about who was going to which campus and who would be in and out would be made in his office. And she would be in charge of recruitment and admission of students. She would also be in charge of supervising the registrars to make sure the student records were in order. Each of us had a dean of students to deal with disciplinary problems or answer student questions or shore up students who felt troubled about one thing or another. So she would also supervise the assistant deans of students on the four campuses. And I think those were her main functions. So she started coming to the campus on her own. And I would get horrible complaints. If she visited the registrar on that trip, the registrar would come in and say she's micromanaging me. She doesn't know anything about what a registrar does or what transcripts should look like or how they should be carried out. She's stupid. she's stupid and she's incompetent, and why do I have to put up with her? And my poor registrar would be bitching and complaining. So would the dean of students. She would countermand the dean of students. The dean of students would decide that some student, an administrative warning was fine. They had had a good talk, and the student was going to get their shit together. And no, the her boss, her new boss, would want to punish the student, would summon the student out of class and say, "You're the assistant dean of student affairs here is too lenient with you. You're going to get a punishment, and the punishment is going to be X. And you're on probation. You're going to get thrown out of school if there's any more trouble with you." She would just override the local authority. And again, I would have an irate and terrible, upset person on my staff coming to me complaining about what was happening. Then I had my own complaints about Nicholas Cummings. When I was graduating from college, I had a part-time job as the production control person in a paper bag factory. And what it consisted of was I was being screamed at all the time. I was being screamed at by the salesman because I wasn't getting his orders out when he had promised them to be delivered or in the order he wanted them to be made. And I was being screamed at by the foreman of the shop who was giving me messages. "You go tell that guy to fuck himself. Machine number 8 is down. It's got a broken gear. I can't make his goddamn bags until next week when I get a part. Air Expressed over here. He's an asshole. We can't satisfy his whims. Tell him to go fuck himself." So I would report the foreman told me to tell you to go fuck yourself, and I would deliver the message. I felt like a ping pong ball. I had all this responsibility. I was supposed to keep harmony and make production happen smoothly, but I had no authority to do anything to anybody. It was a job of great impotence. Well, I was back in that as the campus dean. You heard about some of my administrative personnel complaining about the president's mistress. I would tell him, I would try and tell him as delicately as possible, "I know she's special in your life, but are you sure we can tolerate having her in the position she's in? And she's causing trouble on my campus." And he would tell me, "You go home and tell my staff people they report to her and they have to please her. I trust her judgment. Oh, by the way, she had only a bachelor's degree, and I forgot what it was, in fine arts. I think she had no management experience, no training in academic administration, nothing other than she was probably very soothing and comforting in bed." Uh, when the deans got together, I'm off topic again. When the deans got together, we often gossip that we think what she did was she put on an apron and a whip, and she would call him a bad boy and whip him, and that's what he loved. we, we would daydream about what their sex life consisted of. The next thing was he couldn't delegate any responsibility. For God's sakes, he wanted the student admissions centralized in central office because we could not admit a student unless he had read the application and he approved of what the who we were admitting. I couldn't hire a secretary on the Los Angeles campus without his flying down, having to interview the secretary, wanting to know who else had applied, and telling me I'd picked the wrong one out of the possible applicants. I should interview somebody else. He would override me. All I had no authority on the campus either. I could make recommendations to him, but I couldn't make any final decisions. He had to approve of everything. That began to drive the faculty nuts too. He would issue edicts about changes in the curriculum or about He was unhappy with somebody's syllabus and they needed to change their syllabus. And they would come and stand in front of my desk and they throw temper tantrums. Are you going to let him get away with this? There's academic freedom in this world. Who the hell is he to be telling us how we should be teaching classes he doesn't know anything about, or to students he doesn't understand the limitations of? And they would be screaming at me. So my constant life was consisted of being hated and dealing with upset people who were angry with me. I wasn't doing my job properly because on the one hand, I was allowing people on the campus to get out and they needed to be tamed, or I was allowing the president to be a tyrant and he needs to be assassinated. And they're not going to put up with me if I keep allowing him to have his way on the campuses. I'll go on for just a few more minutes. I had two more sources of distress. I had a colleague named Hedda Bogar to deal with too. She had been part of the group of us who had done all the brainstorming and planning to get the school open. She had been chairman of the subcommittee on curriculum, and I had enjoyed working with her, and we had done very well. She felt terribly wounded when time came time to appoint the chief operating officer, namely the campus dean, and I was chosen and not her. I could see the hatred in her face. She hated Nick Cummings for doing that to me, and she hated me for accepting the position. She actually had a daydream that as the senior person, she was in her 60s then, and I was in my 30s. As the senior person, I would have advocated for her because she was the only other person living in Los Angeles for whom it was feasible to have become the campus dean. And instead, I was greedy, selfish, and self-centered, and I had accepted the position. And she spent the first 3 years of my 7 year tenure trying to destroy me. He had given her compensation, just like he had a vice president for student affairs. He appointed her the vice president for academic affairs. And she had a right to go on all the campuses whenever she pleased to review the quality of education that was being delivered, sit in the classroom if necessary, spot faculty member who weren't performing well, spot students who seemed marginal by spying on them. Uh, think about changing the curriculum. She had the right to try and fuck with whatever were the academic arrangements on the class. And uh, those functions were effectively taken away. It wasn't that she was going to be my advisor about those matters. She actually waited for days when I wasn't present on campus, and then she would issue directives. She had her own stationery as the vice president for academic affairs. She would issue directives and make decisions and do it from her lofty perch in central office, and instead of telling me so I could issue either argue with her or issue the directives for my being the leader on the Los Angeles campus. And I eventually told Nick he had to get rid of one of us. She either fired her and got her out of that position because she was undermining me over and over again and taking over significant functions I should be fulfilling, or I was going to resign. He'd have my resignation in the morning. I finally prevailed, and she went off to found the Right Institute and to take all her influence and all the credibility she had with Norton Simon, who was her deep pockets, a very wealthy man, and to open the Right Institute and run a competing school. She was trying to outdo us and make sure that we died and that her school succeeded. So I had her going on as a rival in another form. My final trouble and difficulty was getting all those approvals. Turned out to be something that was hernia making. Each one required the filing of a long and comprehensive self study, parts of which were to be made by the student body organization, parts of which were to be made by administrators carrying various parts possibilities, and parts were to be made by the faculty, and parts were to be made by people who were out in our field training sites who would comment on the goodness and badness and qualities of the students that we sent to them to do work, and also what kind of relationships we were making with them so that we remained on the same pages as we did with all our various field settings in which students were doing something. And I was responsible. I was the liaison to those places. I was the liaison to the Western Association. I was the liaison to the Board of Psychology. I was the liaison to the Western Association of Schools and Colleges and to the State Department of Education. So it was my job as dean to make sure the self-studies were done, filed in a timely fashion, and uh, uh, answered the questions that were being raised in the self-study guideline that was given us. And I will tell you, everybody else but me fucked up. Everybody else didn't read the instructions. Everybody else didn't do the job. I was doing all-nighter for nights on end. These documents were sometimes 300 and 400 and 500 pages long with lots of appendices. They wanted to see, for example, sample student evaluations. They wanted to see sample doctoral projects. They wanted to see sample transcripts. They wanted to see sample everything. They wanted to see policy documents that set forth our policies for how this, that, or the other thing would happen. There were pages and pages and pages of appendices that had to be assembled as well as the text. In that 7 years, I had 13 site visits that I had to host and pull together. And God, it was just enormous and impossible. Somehow it came together. And I will talk about the final stages in reaching the top of that mountain next time, and then go on to professional work again. I think I have about 15, 20 more minutes to talk yet about ending my tale about the years I spent as campus dean. Okay, I think time's up. I'm available for comments about anything now.
Um, Arthur, I was very intrigued by your talking about your adopted children. I just wondered if you could give us a little synopsis of how they are and how this played out in your life.
Yes, but not today. That's a
Okay.
topic that I will address much in much more fuller style when I talk about myself at later ages. I'm still in young marriage, young family.
Okay.
I'm
All right.
gonna I'm gonna do a whole unit on step family creation yet. I haven't
Okay.
talked about the challenges of putting a step family together. So
I see.
yes,
All
that's
right.
one of my topics.
Okay. All right.
Anything
I
else?
was just yeah, I wanted to maybe, I don't know if it's a question, but more emphasize the idea of apologizing to your kids and how important that is. Most of my time raising my son, and even maybe I remember apologizing to him maybe when he was 3 for raising my voice inappropriately. And he would
Yeah.
say, "Oh, you don't have to apologize." But I would tell him, "No, I that wasn't what I aspired to be, right?"
Yes.
And I don't know where it comes from. Maybe, so even some therapists like that, family systems and the hierarchy and all the, the parents above. But I think it's really important to acknowledge our humanness to our kids. And I thought that was,
Absolutely. It came to me rather naturally because I felt that both my parents, in different ways, were wonderful negative role models of how not to parent anything. And often I would say to myself, I never heard my parents take responsibility for screwing up anything, nothing. Not once did I ever hear an apology from them about anything. So I decided if my kid was unhappy with me about something or even looked unhappy with me about something, I would stop for a second and ask myself, did I handle that in a reasonable fashion? Because of course you have to disappoint kids sometimes, and you have to. They get upset sometimes because they can't have exactly what they want when they want it. But did I myself act badly? And certainly getting a divorce really hurts and upsets kids. So I think everybody should take some responsibility and apologize for all the turbulence the kids have to live through if that's the choice a parent makes.
I've worked with a number of kids with alienated parents,
Yes.
usually the father. And, I really was transfixed in terms of kind of like the suggestions that you made. Unfortunately, not all alienated parents have that insight or actually counsel,
Yes,
and most of them really need to be in some type of their therapy for themselves
yes.
to kind of reach that level of insight, to be able to talk with their kids or do some of those things, to try to repair whatever has gone on.
And to do it and keep at it, even if it seems like it's failing over and over again. I you stirred a strange sadness in me, not about the topic we're talking about, but the fact that there are many topics that I'm interested in, I think are important. I like to write. I probably have 8, 10, 12 books in me I could conceivably write, and I'm just never going to write them. I try as best I can. I'm passing on some of that wisdom. If there are lay people who happen to watch the last episode and see themselves in it, that episode in this, maybe it will touch them. It's that paper that I read is posted on my website. Maybe somebody will go visit it if they're shopping for a therapist and happen to see that these are topics of interest to me and I've written about them. Maybe even read it. Oh, that reminds me of what was in one of the papers I read when I was talking to the people in the youth authority, that if all the effort of all of them combined only kept one kid from becoming a perennial member of the penal population of the state, then the whole effort will have been worthwhile. So if one parent happens to read that and changes his or her ways, maybe what I did was worthwhile.
Hmm.
Maybe I can't preach to the multitude. Anything else? All right, I guess we're done until next week. I'll pick up where I left off and finish up with how I'll do a teaser, how I finally got myself assassinated as the campus dean.
Sounds good.
Okay.
See you
Till
next
next
week.
time.